All of this started in the middle of the 17th century, when they started locking up people wholesale.
What you find in the history of psychiatry is you have a conventional history where those who are doing the treating say whatever they're doing, usually to quiet people, is effective. And then you have so often a totally different perspective of those who are being, quote, treated, who see it as oppressive, often violent, robbing of civil liberties, robbing of their right to be, etc.
Mental health treatment has come in many forms throughout history. For most of history, people considered crazy were banished, beaten, or kept locked away in cellars and attics. In 17th century Europe, they were confined in large institutions, not for purposes of treatment, but to remove them from society. At the turn of the 19th century, treatment of emotional distress became medicalized into diseases such as paranoia, dementia, manic-depression, and epilepsy. Doctors even claimed that black slaves who desired to run away had a mental illness called drapetomania, and the recommendation was to beat the slaves into submission. A less punitive, more humane, recovery-based approach to helping individuals in distress came about briefly in the 19th century when the Quakers began moral treatment. At most asylums, more than 50% of newly admitted individuals would be discharged within a year, and a significant percentage of those who left never returned.
The best form of kind of institutional care in the U.S. was led by the Quakers. There were unlocked doors, and they treated people like human beings, and guess what? People moved on with their lives.
Doctors then started using physical treatments. They experimented with high-pressure showers, hot and cold baths, fever therapies, teeth removal, and bloodletting, as well as strapping individuals to spinning boards and tranquilizer chairs. People were also injected with sheep thyroid, metallic salts, horse serum, and arsenic. All of these treatments reportedly had positive outcomes.
There was this idea that people who landed in the hospital were genetic misfits. Back in the late 1800s, 1890, we started getting eugenic ideas in the United States. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants were saying, we have good genes, and the people with bad genes, and they would rank them. And, it would be like people from Southern Europe, and then it would be Jews, and then it would be black people. And people with, quote, mental disorders would be seen at the bottom of this ranking of people by their genetic makeup. The idea was the people with bad genes needed to be prevented from breeding, from spreading their genes. So then they said, well, we need to lock them up. All of a sudden, the idea is to keep them there. And of course, they sterilized them.
In the 1930s and 40s, so-called miracle cures emerged, such as insulin coma therapy, electroconvulsive therapy, also known as electroshock, and frontal lobotomies. At the time, they were considered innovations. The frontal lobotomy even earned Portuguese neurologist Egas Moniz a Nobel Prize, and lobotomies were the surgery of choice for curing severe emotional distress. As World War II ended, soldiers returned with combat fatigue, now called post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, and were put into asylums. Nearly 2,000 World War II veterans were recorded to have received lobotomies. American journalist Albert Deutsch published The Shame of the States and showcased in photographs the horrors of the asylums and so-called treatments that American combat veterans endured.
So what happens between 45 to 55 to begin to shift at least a little away from those aggressive therapies is, of course, eugenics now becomes associated with the Holocaust. Once it becomes associated with the Holocaust, it starts to become a discredited way of thinking about people. So you can now find between 1945 and 55 a switch where the idea is, let's see if we can get people out of hospitals.
In 1946, Congress established the National Institute of Mental Health. Money and energy were poured into finding a magic bullet to cure emotional distress. In 1954, psychiatric drugs became commercialized. These drugs were marketed to the public as the antipsychotic Thorazine, the anti-anxiety drug Miltown, and the antidepressant Ipranezid. Thorazine was actually a major tranquilizer, Miltown was a muscle relaxant, and Ipranezid was an anti-tuberculosis drug.
In the 60s and 70s in America, when they were under pressure from competition of the psychologists who were more popular than the psychiatrists back then. And then the psychiatrists invented this biological psychiatry. Oh yes, there's something wrong with your brain and now we are going to fix it with a drug. It's a myth. I know of absolutely no psychiatric drugs that can fix anything. They don't cure people.
As commercial psychiatric drugs became lucrative, the mental health system grew. A system of control created by a partnership among psychiatrists, pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies.
The pharmaceutical lobby is the largest, most well-funded lobby, period. More than guns, more than the financial industry, more than anything else.
There are many ways of buying doctors, and the research literature shows very clearly that of course you become influenced when you benefit from your relations to the drug industry. They don't buy the junior doctors. They start buying the professors and chiefs of department and so on. They ask them, do you want to be a consultant for us so that we can ask you questions? Or do you want to be on our advisory board and then we pay you for that? Or they make fake trials that are not really scientifically valuable, but are marketing ploys. Then they attach a large number of so-called clinical investigators to them that get something out of this relationship. In 1987, we spent $800 million on psychiatric drugs in this country. By 2010, we were spending about $40 billion on psychiatric drugs. That's a 50-fold increase. And we went from just a few percentage of people on psychiatric drugs to where 15% maybe of the population is taking them on a daily basis. So what happens to disability numbers? Well, you find that between that time, they go from about 1.25 million adults to over 4 million by 2007, and now it's over 5 million adults on disability due to mental disorders. Instead of decreasing the burden, it's going way up. How about children? We didn't used to medicate children. Well, in 1987, there were 16,200 children receiving an SSI payment due to being disordered disabled by a psychiatric disorder. Now we begin diagnosing ADHD, juvenile bipolar, and all this. Now there's 700,000.
As you can see, the history of mental health care is gloomy. In our next segment, we will hear from psychiatric survivors and mental health professionals about the involuntary aspect of psychiatric treatment.